From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. Living through a global pandemic means uncertain times for us all. And uncertain times need unprecedented measures, which the government has had to implement in a hurry.
Many of you are worried about your jobs, about paying the bills, about taking care of your kids, but know that we've got your back.
You might be among the millions of Canadians who are not only struggling with a national health emergency, but have suddenly found themselves out of a job or a sustainable income. Statistics Canada shows the economy shed more than 1 million jobs just last month as businesses were forced to close or reduce hours. And last week, applications opened for the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefits Program. More than 5 million Canadians have applied to it since then.
The Canada Emergency Response Benefit will provide $2,000 a month for the next 4 months for workers who lose their income as a result of COVID-19.
Like thousands of Canadians, you might be wondering whether to apply to this program. It's quick, much-needed cash, even though you don't know whether you qualify for it.
There's been a lot of concern from people ineligible to apply for the CERB the way that it currently stands now.
This is probably the largest aid package in Canadian history. Millions of people have already been approved. What they're going to get is $2,000 per month for the next 4 months, no questions asked. But people do have questions. Who gets this help? Who doesn't? And who might have to pay it back? In today's episode, I speak to Hermie Abraham, an employment lawyer, to answer some of these questions. The Star's Calgary reporter Rosa Saba is also on today to talk about why many are being so easily approved for the emergency fund. Almost too easily. And there's a catch. Hermie Abraham is an employment lawyer who's going to help us untangle some of this. Thank you so much, Hermie, for joining us today. I know it must be a very busy time for you.
Yeah, it is. It's a busy time, and I think a confusing time for many Canadians. And so, hopefully we'll be able to shed some light and help with the dialogue and answer questions.
Right. And let's just try to break it down for people who have so many questions about this. And let's just start from step one. When we're talking about help, should you apply to CERB or EI? Can you give us a bit of a distinction and how much you get from each?
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer to that question is it really depends on the individual circumstances. So the first sort of criteria I would say is an individual should determine when did their job stop, right? When was the stoppage of work? If it happened before the 15th of March, then they're not going to be eligible for the CERB program. They're going to have to apply for employment insurance, and they'll have to meet the employment insurance criteria to get paid. So that's the first thing. The second is to determine if it is after the 15th, if you lost your job after the 15th of March, then you'll have to see if you're eligible for the CERB. And the CERB eligibility is somebody who was actually working, so you have to be actively employed in some capacity. You can be a contractor, you can be a self-employed, you can be a gig worker, part-time, full-time, that doesn't matter, but you have to have been working. Your work has to have ceased for a 14-day period, for 14 consecutive days, and it has to be related to COVID, right? So if your work stopped for another reason, I can't imagine how people would not be impacted by COVID right now, but if it stopped for another reason and it's not COVID related, then you wouldn't be able to apply. So let's say, for example, you're taking the time off because of an injury or something like that. It would not be COVID related. You would have to apply to the EI sick leave benefits program. So that's the main criteria for the CERB, that you have, one of the main criteria, I should say, that you have stopped working. There's been some kind of disruption where there's been no income for 14 consecutive days. And the other criteria is that you made $5,000 in income from employment in 2019 or in the last 12 months. And so if somebody's kind of going through the criteria of what should I apply to, I'd say, first, determine whether or not this work stoppage happened before the 15th or after the 15th of March. If it's after the 15th, then the CRB would be the main one. However, if you didn't make $5,000 in 2019 or in 12 months before the deadline which you're applying, or if you haven't been without income from work for 14 days, the CERB wouldn't apply.
I want to get into a step-by-step situation. So what would be the process if somebody is eligible for this? Can you give us a bit of a walkthrough of how they can apply?
So there's a government website right now that's open, and I don't have the website, but it's canada.ca, I believe, and there's a subset of that takes you to the CERB program. Now, when they're applying for the CERB, and I have limited knowledge because I actually haven't gone through the application myself, they're going to have to provide a declaration. So I don't believe that you have to provide any details like a T4 slip or provide any of that. You have to provide your social insurance number, and you have to declare that you meet the criteria for which the benefits are being provided. And with that, after that, the payments are made to people. The payment is, I think, 3 days if you're doing auto deposit and 10 days if you're doing checks. So go to the website, make sure you have your social insurance number available, and ensure that you meet the criteria. And I'll just quickly go through the criteria. 15 years of age, you reside in Canada, you have stopped working or don't have earnings for 14 days consecutively as a result of COVID, and you stopped working after March 15th, and you made over $5,000 in income, whether that's employment income, self-employment income as a freelancer gig. It could even include maternity benefits as well, provided an EI. And that $5,000 would have been made in 2019 or 12 months prior to the date that you're applying.
Right. So we're talking about the criteria here. And as you mentioned, you need to have an income of $5,000 proven on paper to be eligible for this. There's a lot of people in Toronto who are basically hustle employed or in the gig economy. So they're working cash jobs, they're gig workers, and they've been expressing concerns about how they would be able to get the money or get any help. So do you feel like there's anything in this for them?
Unfortunately not. And I think that's the vulnerabilities of precarious employment is highlighted at a time like this because of the fact that there are going to be people who are left behind who are working either under the table or working cash jobs because declaring income might not give them the same type of benefit if they were just being paid cash. So there will be people left behind. My sense with those people, unfortunately, is that risk was always there. So many people who do have jobs where they're being paid cash under the table, if they lose the benefit of that job, they don't even have the employment insurance regime to fall back on typically, right? Because of the fact that under the employment insurance regime, you would have to show that you've met the criteria, which is that you have insurable earnings. And so the fact is, prior to COVID, those individuals were always vulnerable. Now, of course, that vulnerability is further expressed. And I think that, hopefully as we sort of move through a post-COVID situation, we'll start to look at ways that we can help people in precarious employment. So we have decent wages, so people do have livable wages, that we have other benefits that are available to people who are precariously employed. But unfortunately, this particular relief program does leave them behind.
So there's different ways that your employment can be affected by COVID. The criteria for the CERB seems to suggest that if you've lost a job as a result of this, there's a lot of people who may have been impacted in other ways. Their hours of work might have been reduced, or they might have a part-time job and have lost their main one. Is there any net or any kind of help that they can access?
Yeah, well, again, those types of positions, it depends, right? So for example, the CERB only applies to people who have completely lost income for a period of 14 days, and they meet the $5,000 criteria for the previous 12 months earnings or 2019 earnings. But somebody who is working full-time and now is reduced to part-time or has to have take a reduction to their salary because their employer can no longer afford to pay the wages they had before because no money's coming in to pay for those wages, would not qualify for the CERB. And thankfully, there are some other programs that are available that the government has sort of implemented. They haven't been fleshed out yet, so we're not 100% sure how it's going to work. But there is the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, and that allows an employer, and unfortunately, employees can't apply for this program directly, but the employer can. And if they meet the eligibility criteria, then there is a wage subsidy of 75% of the employee's wages up to a maximum of $847 per week. And so if somebody is working, let's say, on a part-time basis and their wages have been reduced to part-time, this wage subsidy might be able to make up for some of that shortfall, maybe not all of it, but definitely more of that shortfall that's available There's also been other loan programs that are available to businesses, so they can possibly have additional monies available to them to be able to pay for wages and other expenses associated with the business if the business still has to go forward. So, for example, the government has made a $40,000 Canadian emergency business loan available. With that, it's a interest-free loan, and $10,000 of it can be forgiven. So that's another way that there might be an infusion of cash in the business for which a company can then try to pay wages to their employees. Some banks are also looking at some loan opportunities for businesses if they qualify. But again, I think that the government is sort of building the plane as it's flying, right? And so I think that as we kind of move forward and we start to see all the people who are left behind, and I know that they have looked at even expanding the CERB to account for people who've had a shortfall in their wages, hopefully we'll be able to see as we move forward in this new normal, some programs that are going to be able to address people who might not be 100% qualifying for the CERB because of the fact that they might not meet the main criteria, but they still have some kind of either payment because they have had wages or, another eligibility criteria, such as, students who are also kind of left out from these programs.
You interestingly mentioned students. I was just about to ask you about the criteria being that you have to be a citizen or resident. So what kind of groups is this isolating? What about newcomers or people who are here on a work permit, or international students, or perhaps refugees whose status is a little unclear?
Yeah, so refugee status, I'm not 100% sure how that applies. But the good news with the CERB program is that it applies to people who are Canadian residents. And so you have to be a resident in Canada. The qualification, interestingly enough, isn't that you earn $5,000 in Canada, but that you earned $5,000 in the year prior. So, for example, international students would be eligible for it. People who are here as landed immigrants would be able to apply for the CERB. Permanent residents would also qualify as well, too. So your status doesn't necessarily have to be a Canadian citizen, but it is that you are resident here in Canada. So that's definitely a good news story. As it pertains to students, it's not as good news, unfortunately, for them, because many students don't have the necessary interruption of earnings that's required to qualify for the CERB. So some students might have earned $5,000 in 2019 or in 12 months prior because they worked in the summer, or they had some other type of job with a co-op term. But as they're moving forward and school is ending, there's no job prospects in sight, and they haven't necessarily had a 14-day interruption of their earnings to apply. So in those situations, hopefully we'll be able to see some more programs for students. I've said to people who, let's say they were supposed to start a job as of May 1st, and that job is now not going forward or is being pushed back, that May 1st, if they are not earning an income, that they should apply for the CERB, because even if you're a student, that you will have 14 days of interruption at some point when you're supposed to start work. And in that sense, you would qualify provided that you made $5,000 in the year prior. For students who have jobs that have been deferred or have been terminated or ended, the CERB might be available to them. But for those students who are kind of going out and starting a job search, they are unfortunately another group of people who are left behind.
So, Hermie, there might be a lot of people who are residing here. They might be on work permits, but officially they haven't had their permanent resident card yet. Can they apply for this as well?
So they would be able to apply to the CERB provided that there was some job in the future that they were going to be provided. So, for example, again, if they were looking to start work May 1st and there was a chance for them to start work after May 1st, if that job gets deferred because it's no longer available as a result of COVID, after the 14 days, they would have met that criteria for which to apply for the CERB. And the important thing to note is that to qualify for the CERB, you have to just be residing in Canada. If you are residing in Canada, you're qualifying regardless of if you're on an international student visa or if you are just a landed immigrant. You would still be able to qualify because of the fact that you're residing. And the other piece is that the income that you have to show that you've earned, the $5,000, does not have to be income that's earned in Canada. So if you had that income earned in another jurisdiction, in another country, and you can show that, then that would still allow you to qualify for the CERB.
So speaking about the processing time, there's already millions of people in the system to apply for these benefits, and the clock is ticking for many Canadians who have rent and bills piling up. Currently, you mentioned the processing could take between 3 to 10 days. Do you think there seems to be a question mark on the capacity to deliver this over the course of the next few months?
Yes, I think there could be. I have heard, and again, I don't know this for 100% sure, but I do believe I've saw news reports that people have already received some payments for the benefit, and some of them have been backdated to the March 15th date, so they've received 2 payments. I do see that the government is doing the best that they can, and they're moving forward. But I also understand that there will be delays, there will be glitches in the system, and that might impact people. But I think that at this time, we have to understand that, quite honestly, I think our government's doing an amazing job. If you think about just in February, where things are to the types of programs that they've put together in a very short period of time to be able to make up for the shortfalls and to essentially support the public health measures, because the economic piece is a big part too. But all of this is to support a public health measure so our hospitals aren't flooded and our first responders aren't put in more difficult situations. So, I realize that there'll be a lot of pain through this process, but I think that all things considered, the government is doing the best that they can, and it will take a little bit of patience and understanding. I also think that a lot of people who are landlords and typical bill collectors are also exercising flexibility. So hopefully the demands for payment will be lessened for people. So when they get the monies, then they can make the payments that they're able to make.
Thank you so much, Hermie. I'm sure a lot of people will find this very useful in terms of navigating the process and getting the help that they need right now.
Absolutely. Thank you. And, again, thank you for shedding light on this, because I think the media is doing a great job in sort of dispelling a lot of myths. It's really hard. I know a lot of people don't know where to go, don't know where to reach out. And many of us practitioners, we're individuals, so it's hard for us to do the one-on-one answers. And it's great when you're able to collate that information and serve it to the masses. So thank you very much as well, too.
I appreciate that, Hermie. Stay safe.
Same to you. Take care.
That was Hermie Abraham, an employment lawyer, answering some of your questions. As you know, applications started last week. They're being made in groups divided by your birthday to avoid any backlog in the system. So those of you still applying, apply on Monday if you're born in January, February, and March. Tuesdays for April, May, and June. Wednesday is for July, August, and September. Thursdays are October, November, and December. And Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays are open for everyone to apply. The criteria on who qualifies for the CERB is changing and expanding as we move through this crisis, but there's a lot of conversation on social media about how easy it is to sign up. Almost everyone who applies for it is getting it. It sounds like easy money, but it's not. The government says you might have to pay this back later. The Star's Calgary reporter Rosa Saba did some digging on that. Hi, Rosa. Thanks for speaking to me.
Thank you.
So it seems like currently it's almost too easy to apply for the Emergency Relief Fund. Why is that? And what's the catch here?
Well, the fact is it's an emergency fund, right? So unlike EI, they're not looking at your entire application or making absolute certain that you're eligible for the funding. They're basically just saying yes to everyone, which does make sense. It means that they can process the applications much, much quicker. As you know, people are getting funds in their account within a couple of days. So, people are getting money in their accounts, which is exactly what they need. However, the catch is that they might not be eligible because their application isn't being fully looked at. They really only require a little bit of information. There could be a lot of people who are receiving the CERB funding right now and are not eligible for it.
So who are the people who need to keep an eye on this come next tax season, who might have to pay this back?
So there's two groups of people who are probably going to have to pay back the funding they've received. One group is just people who accidentally applied twice, and it's pretty straightforward. Actually, the CRA website now has a disclaimer saying that if you've received 2 payments of $2,000, you applied twice, and they'll notify you shortly. They don't say how, but they'll notify you shortly and let you know that you need to repay it. So that's the first group. The second group is, as I mentioned earlier, some people are actually not eligible. The CRA has been tweeting at people who have been asking, am I eligible? How do I know? And saying, essentially, because this is an emergency payment, you're just going to get it right away. And if you've applied in error, you'll be asked to repay what you received at a later date. They don't say when. We reached out to the Employment Ministry, and they said that come tax time next year, the government will be able to verify all the eligibility criteria. So we really don't know when this second group of people are going to be asked to repay the money. It could be soon, but it could be all the way until next year before you find out whether or not you repay it. So I'd say that for anyone who's not sure whether they're eligible for CERB, it's really best to be careful about how you spend that money and only spend it on things you really need, because you never know when you're going to be asked to pay it back. And I will say that the eligibility criteria might change. There's a petition going on right now with thousands of signatures asking that the eligibility criteria for CERB be expanded. And the Prime Minister has said they'll look into this, specifically for people who are making a small amount of money, but nowhere near $2,000. So it's important to keep up with the changing eligibility criteria as well.
Right. Things are very fluid at the moment, but thank you for clarifying that for us, Rosa.
Happy to do it. Thanks.
That was the Star's reporter, Rosa Saba, explaining the situation and why it might be a good idea to try to hang on to some of the extra cash. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mudhar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.